The sound of shattering glass still echoed in Dominic's ears as he stood frozen, staring at the splintered remains of his laptop on the hardwood floor. His father's words, venomous and sharp, cut deeper than the shards. You don't deserve a future because you're gay. In that moment, the world Dominic had built, his dreams, his thesis, his fragile hope, crumbled under the weight of his father's rage. It was supposed to be a quiet evening in their suburban Chicago home, the kind where Dominic could lose himself in the final chapters of his sociology thesis. A 200-page labor of love, exploring identity, and belonging in marginalized communities. At 25, Dominic was a senior at Northwestern, a brilliant student with dark, soulful eyes and a quiet intensity that drew people to him. His professors called him a visionary. His friends called him unshakable. But tonight, in the house he'd grown up in, he felt like a stranger. The fight had erupted without warning. Dominic's father, Richard, a stoic man with a temper forged in years of rigid expectations, had found a photo on Dominic's phone, a candid shot of him laughing with Ethan, his boyfriend, at a campus pride event. The image was innocent, joyful even, but to Richard, it was a betrayal. You think you can flaunt this choice in my house, he'd roared, his voice shaking the walls. Dominic tried to explain, to bridge the chasm between them. But Richard's fury was a wildfire, consuming reason. The laptop, Dominic's lifeline to his work, was the first casualty. Dominic knelt among the wreckage, his hands trembling as he salvaged what he could, a cracked USB drive, a few scattered notes. His thesis was due in 3 days, the culmination of years of research and a ticket to a graduate program at UCLA. Without it, his future was a blank page. He could still hear his mother, Ellen, sobbing quietly in the kitchen, her silence during the argument louder than any words. He didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, he grabbed his jacket, the USB drive, and what was left of his dignity, and slipped out into the chilly October night. The Chicago suburbs stretched out in neat rows of identical houses, their windows glowing with warmth he no longer felt. Dominic's phone buzzed in his pocket. Ethan, probably sensing something was wrong. He ignored it. He needed air, space, a moment to piece himself back together. The park at the end of the street was his refuge, a place where he and Ethan had spent countless evenings dreaming of a life beyond judgment. The oak trees were ablaze with autumn hues, and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves. Dominic sank onto a bench, his breath visible in the cold, and finally let the tears come. They weren't just for the laptop or the thesis, but for the father he'd never reach, the home that no longer felt like his. His phone buzzed again, insistent. This time, he answered. Dom, what's wrong? Ethan's voice was steady, grounding, like a lighthouse in a storm. At 26, Ethan was a graphic design major with a warm smile and a knack for seeing beauty in chaos. They'd met at a campus open mic night, where Ethan's poetry about love and resilience had left Dominic speechless. Everything's gone, Dominic whispered, his voice breaking. My dad, he destroyed my laptop. My thesis, he said, I don't deserve a future. Ethan's silence was heavy, but not empty. It was the kind that held space for pain. Stay where you are, he said finally. I'm coming to you. Minutes later, Ethan's beat-up Honda pulled up, and he was there, wrapping Dominic in a hug that felt like salvation. Under the glow of a street lamp, their foreheads pressed together, Ethan whispered, "You're enough. You've always been enough." Dominic clung to those words, a lifeline in the dark. But the clock was ticking. 3 days to salvage his thesis, to rebuild what his father had tried to erase. Dominic didn't know if he could do it, but with Ethan by his side, he felt the first flicker of fight reignite. This wasn't just about a degree anymore. It was about proving he deserved to exist, to love, to thrive. The next morning, Dominic woke up on Ethan's couch in his small Evanston apartment, the smell of coffee pulling him from a restless sleep. Ethan's place was a cluttered haven of art supplies, books, and half-finished canvases, a stark contrast to the sterile order of Dominic's childhood home. Sunlight streamed through a cracked window, catching the dust motes in a quiet dance. Ethan was already up, hunched over his own laptop at the kitchen table, his blonde hair a mess from running his hands through it. "I've got an idea," he said without preamble, sliding a mug of coffee toward Dominic. "The library has computers, and I bet your thesis is backed up on the cloud. Right?" Dominic nodded, hope flickering. He'd been meticulous about saving his work to a cloud drive, a habit born from years of paranoia about losing data. But the USB drive in his pocket, now his only physical copy, was damaged. He pulled it out, its cracked casing a grim reminder of last night. "If this is fried, I'm screwed," he muttered. "Then we'll figure it out," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You're not doing this alone." The Northwestern Library was a hive of activity. Students hunched over books and screens, the air thick with the hum of deadlines. Dominic logged into a public computer, his heart pounding as he accessed his cloud drive. Relief washed over him. The thesis was there, all 200 pages, untouched. But when he tried the USB drive, the computer spat out an error. Corrupted. His stomach sank. The drive held his raw data, interviews with queer youth that were the heart of his research. Without them, his thesis was just theory, not proof. Ethan squeezed his shoulder. "We'll find another way. You interviewed those kids yourself. Maybe you can reach out to them again." Dominic shook his head. "Some of them were anonymous. They trusted me to protect them." The weight of that trust pressed against his chest. His thesis wasn't just academic. It was a promise to amplify voices like his own, voices that had been silenced too long. By noon, they had a plan. Ethan, ever the optimist, suggested they visit the community center where Dominic had conducted most of his interviews. Maybe someone there could help. The center, a modest brick building in Chicago's Boys Town, was a safe haven for queer youth, its walls covered in murals of hope and resistance. Inside, the air smelled of cheap coffee and possibility. They were greeted by Marissa, the center's director, a fierce woman in her 40s with a buzz cut and a warm smile. When Dominic explained his situation, leaving out the uglier details about his father, she didn't hesitate. "We've got your back," she said, pulling out a binder of contact logs. "Some of the kids you talked to are still around. I can't give you names, but I can make calls." As Marissa worked the phones, Dominic and Ethan sat with a group of teens in the center's lounge, their stories spilling out like a lifeline. One boy, Javier, spoke of coming out to his religious family and finding refuge here. Another, Aisha, a non-binary teen, shared how the center had helped them navigate school bullying. Listening to them, Dominic felt his resolve harden. This was why he'd chosen this path, to give a voice to those who felt invisible. By evening, Marissa had tracked down 3 of the original interviewees willing to re-record their stories. It wasn't all of them, but it was a start. Dominic's hands shook as he typed notes. Ethan beside him, sketching ideas for a visual presentation to make the thesis stand out. They were a team, and for the first time since the fight, Dominic felt like he could breathe. But back at the apartment, a text from his mother stopped him cold. "Your father wants to talk. Please come home." Dominic's heart raced. He wasn't ready to face Richard again, but the pull of family, fractured as it was hard to ignore. The drive back to the suburbs felt like a march to the gallows. Dominic's hands gripped the steering wheel of Ethan's car, his knuckles white. Ethan sat beside him, quiet but present, his hand resting lightly on Dominic's knee. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said softly. "Not after what he did." "I know," Dominic replied, his voice tight. "But if I don't, I'll always wonder if things could have been different." The house looked the same, neat lawn, white shutters, the facade of a perfect family. Inside, Richard sat at the dining table, his face a mask of exhaustion. Ellen stood by the sink, her eyes red-rimmed but hopeful. The air was thick with unspoken apologies. "Dominic," Richard began, his voice low, "I lost my temper. I shouldn't have broken your things." It wasn't an apology. Not really, but it was the closest Dominic had ever heard from his father. "You didn't just break my laptop," Dominic said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "You broke something bigger. You said I don't deserve a future. Do you still believe that?" Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Ellen stepped forward, her voice trembling. "We love you, Dom. We don't understand this part of you." Dominic's chest ached. He wanted to scream, to shake them until they saw him, really saw him. Instead, he took a breath. "I'm not asking you to understand. I'm asking you to let me be." The conversation spiraled, voices rising, old wounds reopening. Richard's frustration boiled over again, though this time he kept his hand still. "You're throwing away everything we gave you for this lifestyle," he spat. Dominic didn't flinch. He'd heard it before, but hurt less now, dulled by the strength he'd found in Ethan and the community center. He left without a resolution, but with a clarity he hadn't had before. His family might never accept him, but he wasn't alone. Back in Ethan's car, he let out a shaky laugh. "That was a disaster," he said. Ethan grinned. "But you stood your ground. That's not nothing." Back at the community center the next day, Dominic threw himself into rebuilding his thesis. Marissa had pulled through, connecting him with 2 more interviewees. Their stories raw, honest, filled with pain and triumph, reminded him why he'd started this journey. He typed furiously, weaving their voices into his work, while Ethan worked on a digital presentation to accompany the thesis, his sketches bringing Dominic's data to life. But time was running out. The deadline loomed, and Dominic's advisor, Dr. Patel, emailed a reminder. The thesis needed to be submitted in person at the department office. No exceptions. Dominic felt the pressure mounting, a ticking clock in his chest. He hadn't slept properly in days, and the weight of his father's words still lingered, a shadow he couldn't shake. That night, as they worked late in Ethan's apartment, Dominic's phone buzzed again. An unknown number. He answered, cautious, and a familiar voice came through. Javier, the teen from the center. I heard you're fighting for us, Javier said. Don't give up. Okay, your work it matters. Dominic's throat tightened. He looked at Ethan, who was watching him with quiet pride, and felt something shift. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was for Javier, for Aisha, for every kid who'd ever been told they didn't belong. The library was a war zone of deadlines. Students scrambling as the clock ticked closer to submission day. Dominic and Ethan claimed a corner table, surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled notes. Dominic's thesis was nearly complete, but the missing interviews gnawed at him. He needed one more voice to round out his data, someone whose story could tie the narrative together. Marissa came through again, introducing him to Leo, a 19-year-old trans man who'd been kicked out by his family, but had found a new home at the center. Leo's story was raw, years of rejection, then resilience, forged in the fires of self-acceptance. As Dominic recorded Leo's words, he felt a kinship, a shared defiance against a world that tried to erase them. Ethan, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of creativity. His presentation slides were stunning, blending stark statistics with vibrant visuals of queer joy. You're telling their stories, Ethan said, tweaking a color palette. I'm just making sure people see them, but the pressure was relentless. Dominic's eyes burned from staring at the screen, and his body ached from sleepless nights. Ethan noticed, pulling him away for a quick walk through campus. The autumn air was sharp, the leaves crunching underfoot. They stopped by a fountain, the water catching the light in a quiet shimmer. Ethan took Dominic's hand, his touch steadying. You're almost there, he said. Don't let the noise win. The noise. His father's voice. His mother's silence. The fear of failure. It was all noise. Dominic leaned into Ethan, their foreheads touching, and for a moment, the world was just them. Back at the library, disaster struck. The computer crashed mid-save, eating the last chapter Dominic had written. He stared at the blank screen, panic rising, but Ethan was already on it, digging through the cloud's version history. It's not gone, he said, pulling up an auto-save draft. You're not losing this. They worked through the night, rebuilding the chapter, polishing every word. By dawn, the thesis was whole again, stronger for the stories it carried. Dominic printed it out, the pages heavy in his hands, a testament to everything he'd fought for. But as he prepared to submit, another text from his mother arrived. Your father's sorry. He wants to see you graduate. Dominic's heart twisted. Part of him wanted to believe it, but the scars were fresh. He showed the text to Ethan, who frowned. Do you want him there? I don't know, Dominic admitted. I want him to see me succeed, but not if it's just a save face. Ethan nodded. Then focus on you. This is your moment. The submission deadline was hours away. Dominic gathered his thesis. Ethan's presentation loaded on a new USB drive and headed to the sociology department. The weight of the pages felt like armor, each one a piece of his soul. But as he walked across campus, a new fear crept in. What if his father showed up? What if he didn't? The sociology department office was a flurry of activity. Students clutching binders and flash drives, their faces etched with exhaustion and hope. Dominic stood in line, his thesis a lifeline in his hands. Ethan waited outside, giving him space but close enough to be there if needed. The act of handing over the pages felt monumental, each one a defiance of his father's words. Dr. Patel, his advisor, was waiting. A no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind. She'd been Dominic's champion since his first year. She flipped through the thesis, her eyes scanning the introduction. "This is ambitious," she said, a rare smile breaking through. "You've given a voice to people who need it. I'm proud of you." Dominic's throat tightened. Her words were a balm, soothing the wounds his father had left. He handed over Ethan's USB drive with the presentation, explaining its role. Dr. Patel nodded. "This could set you apart for UCLA. You got something special here." As he left the office, a weight lifted, but the shadow of his family lingered. He found Ethan outside, leaning against a tree, sketching in a notebook. "Done?" Ethan asked, looking up. "Done," Dominic said, a small smile breaking through. They walked to the park, the same one where Dominic had fled that first night. The air was colder now, the leaves nearly gone, but the space felt different, less like a refuge, more like a victory. They sat on their bench, shoulders touching. "What now?" Ethan asked. "Graduate. Move to LA. Keep fighting," Dominic said, the words coming easier than he expected. "With you, if you're up for it." Ethan's laugh was warm, his eyes bright. "Try stopping me." But the moment was interrupted by a familiar figure approaching, Richard. Dominic's heart sank, then steadied. His father looked older, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes held something new. "Regret. Maybe." "Dominic," he said, his voice rough. "I was wrong. I don't understand you, but I don't want to lose you." Dominic studied him, searching for sincerity. He wanted to believe it, but trust was a fragile thing. "I need time," he said finally. "You hurt me, Dad." Words like that, they don't just disappear. Richard nodded, his face tight. "I'll be at your graduation, if you'll have me." Dominic didn't answer. He watched his father walk away, the distance between them still vast, but not unbridgeable. Ethan squeezed his hand. "You okay?" "I will be," Dominic said, and for the first time, he believed it. The days before graduation were a blur of final exams and late-night talks with Ethan. The community center threw a small party for Dominic, the kids he'd interviewed cheering him on. Javier gave him a drawing, a simple sketch of a phoenix rising. "That's you," he said. Dominic kept it in his wallet, a reminder of what he was fighting for. Graduation day dawned bright and cold, the Northwestern campus alive with caps and gowns, families snapping photos, and the buzz of new beginnings. Dominic stood in his robe, the weight of the past weeks still heavy but balanced by pride. His thesis had earned high praise, and Dr. Patel had already sent a recommendation to UCLA. The future was his, hard-won and bright. Ethan was in the crowd, his grin a beacon as Dominic crossed the stage. Marissa was there too, along with Javier and Aisha, their presence a reminder of the community that had carried him through. But his eyes kept drifting to the back of the auditorium, where Richard and Ellen sat, stiff and uncertain. After the ceremony, they approached. Ellen hugged him, tears in her eyes. "We're so proud," she whispered. Richard extended a hand, hesitant. "You did good, son," he said, his voice rough but softer than before. Dominic shook his hand, the gesture formal, but a start. "Thanks for coming," he said, leaving it at that. Healing would take time, but the door was open, just a crack. Later, at the community center's celebration, Dominic and Ethan stole a moment outside. The city sparkled in the distance, alive with possibility. Dominic thought of the kids he'd interviewed, their stories now part of his thesis, part of the world. He thought of his father's words, once a wound, now a challenge he'd overcome. "You changed things," Ethan said, his hand slipping into Dominic's. "Not just for you, but for them." He nodded toward the center, where laughter spilled out. Dominic smiled, his heart full. "We changed things," he corrected. They stood together, the autumn wind carrying the promise of new seasons. Dominic's future wasn't just his degree or his acceptance to UCLA. It was the life he was building, one where love and identity weren't battles, but victories. His father's words had tried to break him, but instead, they'd forged him. He was Dominic, unapologetically himself, and that was enough.